So one of my favorite attractions at Disneyland disappeared from park maps in 1995. Today, it only has a single sentence referencing it on Disney's website. Despite this attraction being one of the last ones Walt Disney worked on before his death in 1966, it lies almost forgotten in the southeastern corner of the park. Now, I'm being a bit dramatic here, but there is something genuinely sad about an attraction that is such a well-preserved piece of Disneyland's history not really being talked about anymore. Thousands of hours were spent creating these two attractions, and today the effort of those artists and engineers goes unappreciated. I swear this isn't just an excuse to talk about trains. In 1995, Disneyland Park opened in California as a small addition to the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad. After over 40 years, Walt Disney had finally achieved his dream of an almost life-size train set. Walt had worked for the railways as a teenager, selling newspapers and snacks to passengers on the Missouri Pacific trains traveling between Jefferson City and Kansas City. By the end of the Second World War, the stress of running the Walt Disney Studio had taken its toll, and Walt was given doctor's orders to enjoy himself with the hobby. After buying a model train set for a nephew one Christmas, he rekindled his lifelong love of trains. He soon discovered that many of his animators were also train enthusiasts. Ollie Johnson owned a large-scale model railway that he rode around in his back garden, while Ward Kimball owned a full-size narrow-gauge steam engine that he'd restored. Inspired by them, Walt soon built his own model railway that travelled across trestle bridges and through tunnels around his home in Holmby Hills.
After the track layout had been worked out on paper, 3 months were spent excavating my backyard to fit the plan of the layout. Of course, the hardest part of the job was convincing my wife that the flower beds had to go.
However, Walt's passion for trains was insatiable. His idea of an expanded model railway around a small park for visiting families eventually turned into a much grander idea for an amusement park called Disneyland. Disneyland's Railroad, which we shall respectfully call by its full title of the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad, was sponsored by the real-life Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. The Santa Fe was the only railway company that had actually replied to Walt when he started looking for corporate partners. Disneyland's initial 2 steam engines were built smaller than full-size locomotives, but they were still much larger than the 1/8 scale of Walt and Ollie's back garden toys. Although Knott's Berry Farm up the road had full-size trains bought from the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad and the Rio Grande Southern, Walt decided to build his trains to be as small as possible while still accommodating an average-sized person. Presumably this was to help with forced perspective, as full-size trains would have required a much bigger Main Street station to look proportionate. I don't think the youth of today realize how big steam engines actually were. Final locomotives were built at 5/8 scale, which is approximately 65% the size of the real-life engines they were based on, and were to be run on a narrow-gauge rail. The first was based on the Lily Bell from Walt's Back Garden Railway, which was in turn based on the Central Pacific Railroad engine number 173, originally built in 1864. Disneyland's second engine doesn't seem to have been based on a specific example from history, and is instead a general representation of a classic turn-of-the-century American locomotive. Both trains were built from scratch at the Disney Studio in Burbank, with some parts being contracted out to manufacturing companies. Disney employees that were passionate about trains were tasked with designing the attraction and getting a replica steam railway fully operational in time for Disneyland's opening day. This included both Ward Kimball and Ollie Johnson, as well as fellow model train fan Eddie Sargent, former railway draftsman Egg Liggenfelter, machinist Roger Brogy, and supervisor Earl Vilmer. The group were referred to as the Steam Freaks by other Disney employees. The railroad was the first Disneyland attraction to be finished, with the 2 locomotives being nearly complete by June of 1955. Walt named them the C.K. Holiday and the E.P. Ripley, after former presidents of the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, despite neither of the engines actually being based off a train from that company. The Santa Fe logo is prominently displayed throughout the ride, with the Disneyland ride being treated as another branch line of the real-life railway. Brochures in the park advertised Santa Fe's other routes, which included trains to the Grand Canyon. Interesting. The Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad encircled the park, with only 2 stations located in the thematically appropriate lands of Main Street and Frontierland. Each station had sidings for the other train to pass by if one locomotive was busy loading or unloading passengers. The EP Ripley would depart from Main Street and embark on the grand circle tour of the park without stopping, with passengers seated in replica train cars with forward-facing wooden seats. Meanwhile, the CK Holiday would leave from the Frontierland depot to do a loop of the park, with passengers riding in open-air cattle cars with no seating. When Ward Kimball raised safety concerns about the cattle cars, Walt had replied, "I want all the people inside those cars to feel the way cows feel, looking out the slats on a real cattle train."
I think this time we really raised the level of immersion.
Visitors would get a good view of the park too, as early Disneyland was much sparser than it is today. The 2 locomotives operated this way for a year, until the Fantasyland depot was built in 1956 and the trains switched to their current configuration of stopping at every station along the route. Eventually, Walt's drive for improvement would see him turn his gaze once more to his beloved railroad. Feeling that the tour needed some sort of finale, he tasked Claude Coates with designing one. Near the end of the loop, between the Fantasyland and Main Street stations, there was a long tunnel that hid backstage areas and car parks from visitors. This long tunnel would be the perfect place, Walt decided, for the longest diorama the world had ever seen. But why a diorama? Habitat dioramas became popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. A traditional habitat diorama consists of a curved backdrop with a foreshortened painting that blends into real-life foreground, filled with representations of rocks and plants and water. Taxidermy animals are then posed in the space, often in family groups. The birth of the modern Natural History Museum in the late 19th century democratized access to education, and habitat dioramas played a key role in allowing anyone who visited to see exotic animals and locations they would never have been able to afford to experience otherwise. Early dioramas also inspired the general public to care about the destruction of animals and nature. The American Museum of Natural History's Florida wading birds diorama from 1902 raised awareness of the population's decrease from hunting, leading to the creation of the first federal bird reserve in 1903. Many of the early pioneers in taxidermy were both artists and scientists, and they went on long expeditions to kill and collect their own specimens. William T. Hornaday saw wild success with his American buffalo diorama displayed at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. in 1888. The species were already thought to be nearly extinct, and the successful display of this symbol of America was so popular, the American Museum of Natural History in New York also wanted a version. Carl Akeley also pioneered many aspects of modern taxidermy preparation and display during the turn of the century. His muskrat diorama at the Milwaukee Public Museum was one of the first modern habitat dioramas, and he went on to create many of the impressive dioramas at both the American Museum of Natural History and the Field Museum. Habitat dioramas are a combination of artistry and education, technical skill and scientific skill. They've been used to show off animals from faraway lands and animals that are seen as symbols of the American nation. They share many of the same values that Walt had when building Disneyland, taking visitors of all ages into a made-up miniature world with the hopes of inspiring and educating them. By the time Walt decided to add one to the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad in late 1958, dioramas would have been a bit old-fashioned. But nobody had made a diorama and then driven a train through it yet, and by God was Walt going to drive that train. Initially, Walt thought about creating a dinosaur diorama, with the train functioning as a sort of time machine to take guests back to the age of reptiles. He also considered a classic natural history diorama of the Grand Canyon. Claude Coates' son remembered that Dad worked on both ideas and waited for Walt's decision. The canyon or the dinosaurs? As a teenager, I was dinosaur crazy, so I was rooting for the reptiles. But one evening, Dad came home and announced, well, it looks like it's going to be the Grand Canyon. I think even he was a little disappointed. But why the Grand Canyon? Tourism to the Grand Canyon was still a fairly recent phenomenon in the 1950s, but it had already become a symbol of the West and the open freedom of the wilderness. Much like the American buffalo, the Grand Canyon was a symbol of America. And if there's one thing Walt loved more than trains, it was America. The canyon's vastness and difficult terrain made exploration dangerous during the early days of America's colonization. In 1857, Lieutenant Joseph Christmas Ives rode a steamboat up the river and declared that the region is, of course, altogether valueless, and that after entering it, there is nothing to do but leave. Interest didn't begin to pick up again until further exploration by John Wesley Powell in the 1870s. An Army veteran and a lover of rocks, Powell led 2 expeditions into the canyon and published many exaggerated books on the grandeur and danger of the place. The succinctly titled Exploration of the Colorado River of the West and its tributaries, explored in 1869, 1870, 1871, and 1872 under the direction of the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, is credited with starting the general public's interest in the canyon after its publication in 1875. Even if they were interested though, those who weren't explorers and adventurers would have had a hard time getting to the place. That was until our old friend, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, brought modern tourism into the American wilderness. The Santa Fe and Grand Canyon Railroad Company had initially laid track towards the canyon's southern rim in the late 1800s to serve copper mines in the area. The expected profits from the mines never materialized, though, and the company went bankrupt. The tracks they built stopped 8 miles short of the canyon. The company was then bought by the Santa Fe Railway Company and renamed to the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. They took over the tracks and continued them to the edge of the southern rim with the hope of providing a profitable tourist train. And who was president of this new railway? None other than Abraham Lincoln. No, I'm just kidding. It was E.P. Ripley. On September 17, 1901, the first steam train arrived at the Santa Fe Railway Station on the edge of the canyon. The new railroad line advertised itself as the first train to carry passengers to the Grand Canyon of Arizona, and asked, "Won't you be one of the 25,000 visitors at the Grand Canyon of Arizona this summer?" The route was wildly successful, and by 1917 there were over 37,000 annual visitors to the canyon. By 1919, the Grand Canyon was established in the National Park System. Many of the hotels and shops at Grand Canyon Village were built by the Santa Fe Railway, and visitors could enjoy a scenic train trip for the relatively low price of $3.95. The Santa Fe Railway dominated train travel in the region, and specifically targeted middle-class Americans with advertising that depicted the romantic and awe-inspiring scenery of Arizona and California. The artwork of Hopi tribes and stereotypical depictions of Native Americans were frequently used in advertising material, appropriated to add exoticism to the destinations available. By the 1950s, the character of a small Navajo boy called Chico had become the mascot of the company. As Hal K. Rothman says in his discussion of tourism and Native American imagery in the West, the railroad also played upon the remote nature of the Hopi and their seeming lack of resistance to Anglo-American encroachment. The Hopi mesas were far from the tracks, yet in the pattern of Santa Fe, that made the Hopis seem more Indian in a mythic sense than did Indian people adjacent to the rail lines. The Hopi were quickly deemed as mythically pure, uncontaminated by their limited contact with the white world. When they went dehumanizing native people, the railway also advertised their routes with dioramas. In 1901, the railroad had an electric diorama of the Grand Canyon at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. The Cagney brothers operated a miniature electric railway at the exposition, and although it did not go through the Grand Canyon diorama, it did go around the Midway area and passed by many other heavily themed exhibits. 14 years later, in 1915, the amusement midway of the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco featured another Grand Canyon diorama presented by the Santa Fe Railway. It was completed with a replica Pueblo Indian village to bring to life the company's many adverts. A souvenir guidebook described the exhibit as a gigantic undertaking to give an adequate idea of the Grand Canyon, but the result attained is wonderful in its realism. A miniature railroad was also present on the Midway, running alongside the Pacific Ocean, but it wasn't a popular attraction. Walt's idea of a miniature Grand Canyon to go with his miniature Santa Fe Railroad was not so much a brilliant spark of inspiration as it was history repeating itself. Grand Canyon dioramas had existed in a close proximity to scale railways before. Walt was really just taking the next logical step and smashing the two together. Tourism to the Grand Canyon by train was not only accurate to the turn-of-the-century era evoked by Disneyland's Main Street and Frontierland, but it also worked on sort of a meta level, referencing the diorama and train attractions of previous World's Fairs that had inspired Walt to create Disneyland in the first place. More importantly, though, the real-life Santa Fe Railway Company were the face of tourism in the Grand Canyon. The founding and success of the modern-day company was tied to their immense success in the region, and having a diorama of anywhere else might have had them questioning their sponsorship. If the Northern Pacific Railroad had sponsored the Disneyland Railroad, we might have ended up with the Yellowstone diorama instead. Really, it wasn't a case of if there should be a Grand Canyon diorama, but why it hadn't been done already. Walt also had a few other things on his side. By the late 1950s, road trips and camping in and around national parks were exploding in popularity. After their closure during the Second World War, national parks across the country reopened in 1945 and received unprecedented amounts of visitors. The Grand Canyon was no exception, seeing a 325% increase in visitors between 1945 and 1946. The rates of car ownership had dramatically increased following the war, and this, combined with an increase in vacation time and federal funding for the highway system, meant that more Americans than ever had the freedom of a road trip holiday available to them. National parks were popular destinations for many reasons. First, they appealed to families who wanted to experience the mythic West that they saw on television, as the popularity of Western shows saw places like the Grand Canyon used as backdrops for stirring adventure. Secondly, camping in the wilderness was an appealing way to escape the stress of civilization and relive the pioneer days of America. Camping was also a budget-friendly option, and many national parks invested in improved facilities to meet the growing demand. In her book on the history of American family road trips, Susan Sessions Rue says that family travel helped Americans understand their status as citizens of the American nation. American parents took their children on pilgrimages to national monuments, from the White House to Old Faithful, to cultivate a sense of civic identity and attachment to American history. Rail travel was almost extinguished by this new world of automobile tourism, but the appeal of places like the Grand Canyon was timeless. Visitors to Disneyland would have had a keen interest in the canyon and everything it represented: freedom, the wilderness, the mythic West, America itself. The idea of taking a train to the canyon would have been quaintly nostalgic, fitting in perfectly with the bygone charms of Main Street and Frontierland, but it would have also appealed to contemporary interests in national parks and wilderness vacations. The Grand Canyon was firmly established as a symbol of America by the late 1950s, and many early Disneyland visitors might have even made the trip there to see it for themselves. As was to become customary for Disney employees starting a project, Claude Coates travelled to the Grand Canyon to gather reference materials and make sketches. He was not expected to shoot and kill his own animals, however. An accomplished watercolour artist, Coates had been responsible for the background painting on most of Walt Disney Productions' animated features over the years. Coates eventually moved to Wed Enterprises to help build Disneyland, working on the scenic design for the Snow White, Peter Pan, and Mr. Toad rides in Fantasyland. After his trip to Arizona, Coates painted a rough version of the diorama's background mural and sketched out the foreground scenes. With the help of Fred Jorger and Harriet Burns from the model shop, he created a scale model of the diorama to test out his ideas. One day, Walt came by Coates' office to check up on the progress of the diorama, and remarked on the family of wild turkey that Coates had sketched and added to the scale model. "They don't have turkeys in the Grand Canyon," he said. To which the mild-mannered Coates replied, "Oh yes, they do, Walt." Walt didn't believe him, but he dropped the topic. Sometime later, Walt was showing a guest around the studio and took them to see the work in progress on the Grand Canyon attraction. Again, Walt saw the small family of turkeys, paused, and said, "Are you sure they have wild turkeys in the Grand Canyon?" Expecting this to come up again, Coates replied, "Yes, Walt, I'm sure. I just checked with the naturalists at the museum. The flocks are on the increase." Walt calmly turned to his guest and said, "Did you know they have wild turkeys in the Grand Canyon?" To which his guest responded, "Why no, Walt, I didn't know that." "Well, they do," Walt replied, "and the flocks are on the increase." The backdrop for the diorama was painted by Duncan Spencer and Delmar Yoakum, two seasoned background artists who had worked on hundreds of Hollywood films. The backdrop was painted on a 306-foot-long canvas that ran along the back wall of the railroad tunnel, and it took over 4,800 hours to complete. They were joined by Bob Sewell, who worked on the foreground elements. Sewell had experience working on natural history dioramas in museums across both coasts, and he got to work collecting, preserving, fireproofing, and painting foliage for the set. Although the animals of the Jungle Cruise and the Rivers of America were moving figures that had been created by Disney, the animals inside the diorama are actually real taxidermy. This was not the only time they used stuffed animals either, as the Indian village had a taxidermy bison tied up by one of the fence posts until the removal of the village in 1972. Meanwhile, Walt was making plans for a third train for the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad in anticipation of the crowds this new attraction would bring. The railroad's ridership had doubled each year since the park opened, and more capacity was necessary. Building the first two engines from scratch had been an expensive and time-consuming undertaking, and the Disney workshops weren't really equipped for it. Walt had initially approached Ward Kimball and offered to buy Ward's little plantation engine from Hawaii. Ward had refused, and Walt stopped speaking to him for weeks. Eventually, a locomotive was found. The very practically named Engine 14065 was originally built in 1894 and purchased for the Belle Point and Reserve Railroad. This railroad was owned by Leon Gauchot, and for most of the engine's life it had hauled freshly cut sugarcane in humid Louisiana. By the time Disney purchased the engine, it was in rough shape, but it was restored in the Disney workshops and given the name Fred Gurley, after the current executive of the Santa Fe Railroad. Initially, Walt had only built two sets of train cars. Retlaw 1 was the set of yellow coach cars pulled by the E.P. Ripley, and Retlaw 2 was the infamous set of cattle cars and caboose pulled by the C.K. Holliday. 5 new open-air cars were designed by Bob Gurr to create a third train, called Retlaw 3. Although they still had forward-facing benches, they had open sides that allowed for a better view of the new diorama, and they were inspired by cars used on tourist routes and trolleys during the turn of the century. These 3 trains were referred to in publicity brochures and park maps as the New Excursion Train, the Deluxe Passenger Train, or the Fast Freight Train. Seats were also added to the C.K. Holliday's cattle cars.
Immersion.
Opening day for the Grand Canyon diorama arrived on March 31st, 1958. In a small ceremony with special guests and members of the press, Fred Gurley, the train's first official duty was to ride through the new diorama, and Fred Gurley, the human, accompanied Walt Disney in the cab. The diorama was blessed by a Hopi chief, Chief Nevangnawa, and also featured a small boy portraying Chico, who was featured in many of Disney's publicity photos from the opening. The diorama overlooks the Grand Canyon's southern rim, starting out with a sunrise behind Hopi cliff dwellings and a rattlesnake slithering among the bricks. The scene actually moves between winter and summer, and snow can be seen on some of the Grand Canyon's rock faces in the background at the start. The diorama then gives way to forests overlooking the canyon during the day, populated by a herd of deer. Then, a cougar is seen on an outcropping over the canyon's rim, and a litter of cubs play fight below. As a thunderstorm starts to gather on the horizon, an eagle looks out from a tree branch as a family of skunks run for shelter. This section also includes the controversial turkey flock, peacefully unaware of the drama they caused. The diorama ends with a herd of bighorn sheep looking out over the canyon at sunset. The entire diorama takes 90 seconds to pass by, and is set to the third movement of Ferdy Groffy's Grand Canyon Suite, titled On the Trail. Groffy composed many pieces inspired by the natural beauty of America, and he wrote Grand Canyon Suite between 1929 and 1931. Reflecting on the piece 6 years later, Groffy said, "In writing Grand Canyon Suite, I drew from notes I had made during my constant visits to the rim of the mighty work of nature. I had watched the canyon in all seasons, in all its moods, and my findings were on paper, notes in hieroglyphics that were later transcribed into musical notes." The Grand Canyon diorama was a great success. The Santa Fe Railroad began an advertising campaign featuring both the real Grand Canyon and the new diorama version. It has this very odd framing narrative about giving customers a choice in everything, and that the Santa Fe was the only train company that could take you to 2 different Grand Canyons. You know, for people who would rather see a hollow recreation rather than the real thing. It's me, I'm people. Five years later, Walt's attention was elsewhere. Disney was busy preparing for the 1964 New York World's Fair, and they had 3 marquee attractions they were creating for corporate sponsors. There was the Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln attraction for the Illinois State Pavilion, the Carousel of Progress for General Electric, and the Magic Skyway for the Ford Motor Company. The last-minute edition of It's a Small World for Pepsi-Cola rounded out the total to 4. Ford wanted Disney to show off their new car models, which included the debut of the Ford Mustang, and Disney planned to use the cars as vehicles to take passengers on an exciting and educational ride. The design for the pavilion's ride went through several iterations, and the initial idea was to take riders on a tour of America's national parks. However, Chevrolet had a popular jingle, "See the USA in your Chevrolet," and Ford were reluctant to go with an idea that was so similar to a competitor's advertising campaign. A late pivot for the ride saw the dinosaur diorama and time-traveling train idea that Walt had considered back in 1958 dusted off and repurposed.
Although fairs are supposed to feature the newest thing, we went back over 100 million years for these models.
Now visitors would be taken back to the age of the dinosaurs, through the dawn of man and the creation of the wheel, and into the fantastical future. All of the World's Fair attractions were pioneering in their use of audio animatronics. This new combination of robotic movement and sound synced via a tape system was revolutionary, and it would go on to be an integral part of future Disney attractions. The cavemen and dinosaurs of Ford's Magic Skyway were audio animatronics, to aid in Walt's goal of creating an adventure so realistic that visitors will feel like they've lived through a wonderful, once-in-a-lifetime experience. Another innovation was the ride system itself. The cars passengers would sit in did not have their engines, and were instead propelled along by a moving track that would eventually develop into the system used for the People Mover. In the rush to get the 4 World's Fair attractions finished in time, everyone at WED Enterprises worked long hours across multiple projects. Claude Coates did a lot of the work on the dinosaur section of the Magic Skyway though, as he had an interest in prehistoric history and had done the initial work on the dinosaur diorama concept back in 1958.
It's the biggest, they say, the most beautiful, the most awe-inspiring, the most colorful, the most spectacular event of this era, the New York World's Fair.
The New York World's Fair opened on April 22nd, 1964, and the Ford's Magic Skyway proved to be a very popular attraction at the fair with long queues. After going through a time tunnel at 4 miles per hour, riders would enter a primeval world filled with huge dinosaurs. The stars of this section were the fighting Stegosaurus and Tyrannosaurus. Riders would then see the development of man as cavemen invented the wheel and other technology to help make their lives easier. A second time tunnel takes riders into the future to see the Space City, which is definitely not Epcot. Visitors would then disembark and presumably go buy a Ford Mustang or something. Never one to give praise easily, even Walt was impressed with what his team had achieved with the attraction, saying that this show ushers in a new medium of education as well. Through this system, the door has been opened for a whole new concept in animated exhibits. This permits a different type of museum approach, quite unlike the static displays that have become so traditional. The futuristic flavor of the ride was worlds away from the trains and taxidermy of the Grand Canyon diorama, and I think Walt could sense that there had been a shift in the interests and values of the general public. The audio animatronic technology was space age, the mode of transportation was not a puffing steam train but a sleek new automobile, and the promise of the future was not the open expanse of the western desert, but a glittering utopian city. 3 years after the opening of the fair, the Santa Fe Railroad ended its regular passenger services to the Grand Canyon as automobile tourism took over the park. The age of the railway had ended, and the age of the car was well and truly underway.
Look at this World's Fair parking lot at the fairgrounds. 10,000 cars. Count them.
The World's Fair ran for 2 years and closed on October 17, 1965. Walt Disney had hoped that Ford would want to bring the ride over to Disneyland and continue their sponsorship, but Ford wasn't interested. As the point of the attraction was to sell new cars, they didn't want the expense of replacing the vehicles each year. But Walt was still hopeful that some of the exhibit could be salvaged. He'd never been happy with the rudimentary execution of the cavemen animatronics, so the dinosaurs were chosen to be moved to a new home at Disneyland. The time-traveling train and dinosaur diorama concept finally materialized, as the dinosaurs were sent to be placed along the railroad line after the Grand Canyon diorama. A proposed opening date of summer 1966 was set, and the eastern edge of the railroad was expanded to accommodate the new attraction. Claude Coates was given the job of bringing the diorama together using the 46 audio-animatronic dinosaurs that Disney had kept from the fair. Coates worked with many of the now well-established artists at Wed Enterprises to create the diorama, including artists in the model shop, landscaper Bill Evans, and Xavier Atencio on his first ever Imagineering project. Instead of taking the viewer through a day in the life of a location like he did with the Grand Canyon, Coates wanted to showcase several unique areas and give a sense of progression over time. The placements and locations of the dinosaurs were reworked too, such as the Triceratops family moving from a precarious clifftop to a warm sandy clearing. Coates had sketched out a thick jungle swamp as a home for the Rise Brontosaurus family. When looking over the progress, Walt had pointed to the swamp and asked, "What do you want down here?" To which Coates replied, "That would be real water." "Hell, Claude, we can't have real water," Walt replied. "You can't clean it, and fungus would grow, it'd be a real mess." Coates did not argue, but instead changed his approach and experimented with plexiglass to represent the swamp. The idea was to cut around the animatronic figures and set them into a fake acrylic glass pond. When Walt came by later to check up on the attraction, he asked what the plan for the plexiglass was. "Why can't we use water?" Walt asked. Coates responded by asking, "Do you think we can use real water?" And Walt said, "Sure." The Brontosaurus family got a real swamp, giving everyone on the Submerged Animatronics subreddit something to post about 60 years later. Yeah. Oh, no. Ugh. The Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad did not get the same love and attention it had received for the Grand Canyon diorama. A fourth train, named the Ernest S. March, had already been added to the railroad in 1959, so there was no new locomotive for the opening of this attraction. However, Rattler 1, that beautiful set of bright yellow train cars pulled by the E.P. Ripley, had to go. Their authentically small windows had given guests a restricted view of the Grand Canyon diorama for years, and with another diorama on the way, it made more sense to retire them for something with better visibility. Two new sets called Rattler 4 and Rattler 5 were built. These cars had sideway-facing seating that faced into the park, giving everyone a good view of Disneyland and the two dioramas. The summer of 1966 was a busy one. New Orleans Square opened, along with fellow World's Fair alumni It's a Small World. The previous year, Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln had also opened in Disneyland as the park celebrated its 10th-centennial. With all of these advanced attractions and new lands, the opening of a little dinosaur diorama didn't get much attention. Named Primeval World, this newest addition to the Disneyland and Santa Fe Railroad opened without much fanfare on July 1st, 1966. After the train makes its way through the Grand Canyon diorama, an empty stretch of tunnel gives a visual break between the two attractions, and the train spiel prepares riders to travel back in time. Primeval World opens on a pair of red-eyed Edaphosaurus enjoying the moist swamp. The vista then opens up to show a small family of Brontosaurus feeding on the swamp, before transitioning into rocky cliffs covered in frightening pterodons. The next scene has a family of Triceratops welcoming a new clutch of babies into the world. Then the diorama takes a darker turn as a group of Gallimimus huddle around a shrinking waterhole, and the skeleton of a less fortunate Triceratops is seen in the foreground. The grand finale is a battle between a Stegosaurus and a Tyrannosaurus, as a volcano erupts in the background and lava flows crack apart the ground they're standing on. Inspired by the famous Rite of Spring passage in 1940's Fantasia, the image of these two dinosaurs locked in battle has become iconic thanks to Disney. However, Rite of Spring was not played in this scene, as the original score from the World's Fair was used to soundtrack the attraction instead. According to the Walt Disney Productions Annual Report of 1966, ridership on the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad jumped 65% with the opening of the new diorama. Even if Primeval World didn't have the same scale as the Magic Skyway version of the attraction, it was another wonderful addition to the Grand Circle Tour. The success of this new attraction was dampened, though, by Walt Disney's death 5 months later in December of 1966. Primeval World was the last addition to the Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad, and to Disneyland as a whole, before he died. The Santa Fe Railway ended their sponsorship of the railroad 8 years later in 1974. Neither the Grand Canyon diorama nor the Primeval World diorama were recreated for the Walt Disney World Railroad when it opened in Florida in 1971. I do not know why, and Bob Iger won't return my calls, but both of these attractions have versions in parks outside of America. When Tokyo Disneyland opened on April 15, 1983, the layout of this now iconic railroad attraction was a bit different from the American parks. To avoid government legislation which would have classified the ride as public transit and required closed cars with a ticketed fare, the Western River Railroad does not stop at multiple stations or act as a form of transportation around the park. It is a single, non-stop loop travelling through Westernland, Adventureland, and Critter Country. This version of the Grand Circle Tour is not quite as grand or as circular, but it does avoid another sad, futuristic train station. The Western River Railroad has been sponsored by model train manufacturer Tomy since the park's opening, and it has 4 locomotives. Visually, they're based off Disneyland's 4th engine, the Ernest S. March, and they are named after famous American rivers. There is the Colorado, the Missouri, the Rio Grande, and the big, beautiful blue Mississippi. Can you tell which one's my favorite? Interestingly, the trains all have cars modelled after the excursion cars of Ratlaw 3 with forward-facing seats. This requires me to physically fight small children to get a good view of the diorama, but that is a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And I did say diorama singular, as the Grand Canyon diorama is missing from Tokyo Disneyland. Despite Japan's love of the American West and the lavish attention paid to the Westernland section of the park, there is no celebration of America's biggest hole. Instead, the Primeval World diorama stands alone, tucked deep inside Big Thunder Mountain. The Western River Railroad travels along the edge of Big Thunder, giving riders an excellent view of the ride from a few unusual angles. The tyrannosaur bones by the ride's final drop foreshadow what is about to come. Further around the mountain, the train enters into a tunnel in the rock with a large Triceratops skeleton sitting next to the entrance. Once in the tunnel, riders come face to face with fleshier versions of these great beasts, and the Primeval World diorama unfolds in front of them. The start of the diorama plunges us into the same thick jungle swamp as Disneyland's version. The initial scenes are unchanged, but once past the Brontosaur family, the swamp ends in a delightful little waterfall and more jungle. The next scene is then the Triceratops families welcoming their wiggly little babies into the world. The pterodons on the rock have been moved to the following scene of the thirsty Gallimimus around the watering hole. The grand battle at the end is much the same, although these dinosaurs are a little less arthritic. There are some differences in lighting and the coloration of the dinosaurs, but Tokyo's version captures the awe and mystery of the original brilliantly. As an added bonus, this version of the ride still uses the original score from the World's Fair version of the attraction. So if you've ever wanted to board a real time-traveling train and experience what Primeval World would have sounded like in 1966, you still can. The Euro Disneyland Railroad opened with the rest of Euro Disney on April 12, 1992.
They haven't built them for a good many years, but Disney being Disney, we're going to have a real steam locomotive.
Like Tokyo, Paris has 4 steam locomotives in operation. They're based on the design of Disneyland's CK Holiday and have the rather mismatched names of the CK Holiday, the WF Cody, the G Washington, and the Eureka. The trains for these engines are closer in style to the original yellow Ratlaw 2 coach cars, but they have U-shaped seating looking out of one open side as a nice compromise for visibility. Disneyland Paris's Grand Canyon diorama is found, fittingly, in Frontierland, behind the show building for Phantom Manor. Unlike Disneyland in California, the diorama is one of the first things riders see after leaving Main Street Station and heading into Frontierland's wilderness. The diorama has the same structure and scenes as the original version, but with some extra additions. The opening scene looking out from Hopi cliff dwellings has a fox chasing a critter among the rubble. The deer are given more room to run around with an extended forest section, and a bobcat can now be spotted stalking the forest floors. The cougars also have more space to play, and a second adult cougar is seen with the cubs under a rocky outcrop. As we go deeper into a pine forest, a bear is standing on its hind legs trying to clamber up some rocks. Our beloved turkey flock is being stalked by a band of coyotes and a thunderstorm rolls by. The diorama ends with a group of antelope, not bighorn sheep, looking out at the rainbow. The scenery at the end of the diorama was altered to better match this new location in Frontierland, as riders leave the diorama tunnel and find themselves among the geysers of Boot Hill. Imagineer Jeff Burke explained that the final scene that we had changed in the mural was stunning. We had inserted a portion of a butte from Monument Valley, which visually would coincide then with what they would see as they emerge, Big Thunder across the river. Imagineer Tony Baxter reiterated the need for this merging of these distant locations, saying that the Grand Canyon or Monument Valley, the images that have become familiar through John Wayne westerns, are symbolic for Europeans of the entire American West, even if we feel that in reality these regions are as varied and diverse as Europe is diverse. Ed Johnson was the lead designer for Paris's version of the diorama, and the same studio that had painted Disneyland's original mural decades earlier came back to paint this new version. Like the original, the animals populating the scene are real taxidermy, and a taxidermist from Tucson, Arizona was contracted to supply the French park with mountain lions, deer, coyotes, and 100% authentically Arizonian wild turkeys. Unfortunately for Disneyland Paris's budget, France had a hefty special import levy on taxidermy animals, which was overlooked until the animals were already bolted into position and behind glass in the diorama. Something had to give for the taxidermy animals to stay, and a planned buffalo herd of 6 adults and 1 calf in the rivers of the Far West were cut to save costs. Jeff Burke later reflected, "I don't think I went to any French museum where I saw any taxidermied animals. I guess I understand why." The original Grand Canyon diorama at Disneyland has seen remarkably few changes over the years, likely as a result of the ancient Indian blessing ritual. In 2018, for the diorama's 60th anniversary, projection mapping was added to enhance the weather effects. Beams of sunlight and flying eagles can be seen behind the opening ruins, and thunder and lightning give way to a rainbow further along the canyon's edge. Primeval World has also seen few changes, with some extra lighting effects and projection mapping added to enhance the painted backdrops. Its musical score was updated in the 1990s to be the theme from the 1961 film Mysterious Island, based on the Jules Verne novel of the same name. Aside from these small updates, both dioramas remain as they always have been, sitting in the dark, waiting for the next train to come by. Despite their disappearance from park maps, the railroad dioramas are an integral part of Disneyland history. Every year, millions of people climb aboard the Disneyland Railroad without knowing what's in store for them at the end of the line, and I hope that they get to experience some of the thrill and wonder that audiences would have originally had when these attractions first opened. They may not be as exciting or as big as Pirates of the Caribbean or Haunted Mansion, but I love them just the same. Countless hours are put into painting, modeling, sculpting, lighting, and animating these scenes, both by well-known Disney artists you've heard of and obscure ones that you haven't. I hope I've done their work justice, and I also hope that you look at these dioramas with a new understanding next time you ride the rails. In his 1937 American travelogue, English writer J.B. Priestley looked back on his visit to the Grand Canyon and wrote, "If I were American, I should make my remembrance of it the final test of men, art, and policies. I should ask myself, is this good enough to exist in the same country as the canyon? Is Disney's version as good as the real one? I think they gave it a damn good try." Thanks for watching.
But I don't find time. I've got the railroad blues, but I haven't got no railroad fare. Ain't got no place to go, nobody waiting for me there. I'll get an armful of freight